He was a brilliant child, born in 1818 AD in what is now Germany. He was born into a part of the world that was only just recovering from Napoleon's conquests that we talked about last week. And as he grew up, he was educated by tutors and sent to the top schools. He was the oldest boy of 9 children. He had to help raise his brothers and sisters, making him headstrong. One time, he got into an argument with one of his peers, and he challenged them to a duel. They lined up back to back, then they took 10 paces, turned, and fired guns to settle the argument. He was a radical, a free thinker, someone who questioned everything, a master of suspicion. He was a revolutionary at heart. He once said, "The French Revolution is the revolution par excellence, the most colossal revolution history has ever known." His heart cried out, freedom, equality, fraternity. He rejected church. God is just a fairy tale we invent to feel better about the world. Religion is a drug used to maintain the status quo. Say your prayers, be a good girl, be a good boy. So he began writing for newspapers and journals. He joined radical revolutionary groups. He made quite a name for himself as a disturber of the peace. But yet, for all his radical ways, he eventually decided to settle down and get married. Here comes the bride, here comes the bride. His soon-to-be wife walked down the aisle towards him in her wedding dress. They looked into each other's eyes adoringly as they said their vows. Then the priest stood up between them and announced to all the crowd and the world, "I now pronounce you Mr. and Mrs. Karl Marx." Karl Marx arrived in a time of big moments. The French Revolution had happened. Napoleon, the end of slavery in England, science was growing, factories were being built, train tracks were being laid. The world seemed to be changing so quickly, moving forward, progressing, almost you could say. And people believed that the Spirit of God was behind it all. God was causing these massive shifts and events to take place for some higher reason. God is driving history forward. God is leading us somewhere. And Karl Marx said, "Nah, God isn't driving history. We are. Money, society, class warfare are driving history. Someone doesn't win a war because God was on their side. They win a war because they had more technology, more tanks, more money, better strategy. A Chinese church doesn't hire a white pastor because it was God's will. It was because they were desperate and he needed money." Events don't happen because God wills it. They happen because of economic, social, and scientific and political factors that shape history. Marx believed that the whole world could be understood in material terms, in secular, naturalistic, scientific terms, without needing to turn to God for an explanation of why things happen. And this might seem obvious to you today, but that's because you live in a world that has been so influenced by Karl Marx. I mean, in school, you don't ask, why did God do that? No, you're taught to ask, to look for the material factors, for the social, political, economic reasons why something happened, and that's primarily because of Karl Marx. Marx changed how we think about the world. Marx became the founding father of modern politics. He was involved in modern economics, sociology, philosophy. Marx was an atheist. He didn't believe in God, and his atheism became the lens through which we view reality. Which is one of the reasons why Time magazine ranked Marx the 14th most influential person in human history. But that's not the only reason why he was so influential. Since Marx believed that God was not an adequate explanation for why things happen in the world. He had to come up with some other cause behind events in history. If God is not behind history, what is driving history? And Marx's answer was class. The upper class versus the lower classes, the working classes, the rich versus the poor. People try to grab power and status and wealth. That's why things happen the way they do. That's why wars happen. That's why people act the way they do. All of history, all of the wars and conflicts and back and forth can be seen as the story of class warfare. It's all about the money. God is not driving history. Cash is driving history. Ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. And so if you want to end our history of wars and issues and conflicts, if you want things to be 100% perfect and peachy, you need to get rid of the class system. You need to get rid of capitalism and wealth and private ownership. And instead, you need to replace it with a community that shares everything. A community that has everything in common, where no one is higher or richer than anyone else, where there is no upper or lower classes, where everyone has everything in common. Thus the name, Communism. Marx is the founder of communism. Everything in common. And see, Marx also believed that communism would naturally, it required the end of religion. Religion prevents the lower classes from rising up. Religion keeps people in their place. Religion tells you to say your prayers, be a good girl, be a good boy, know your place. Religion keeps the lower classes down by telling them that's where God wants you to be. God orders society according to his will, and he has placed you in the lower ranks. The poor are willing to be poor and suffer now because God promises them heaven in return for their suffering on earth. Religion drugs the masses with false promises and false hope. Religion prevents the lower classes from rising up and creating a communistic society. Religion is the opium of the masses. That's one of Marx's most famous sayings. Religion is the opium, the drug of the masses. And you're all high. As long as people believe God is driving history, they will accept their low position as God's will for them. But if they realize that God has nothing to do with it, Marx thought, if the people realize God has nothing to do with their order in society, and that class and money is actually behind everything, then they will finally rise up and drive history for themselves. There will be revolution, fighting in the streets, and when the dust has settled, no longer will the rich be rich and the poor poor, but the world will be made right again. There will be no more class system. All money and industry will be shared equally among the people. Everyone will have everything in common. If you want the world to be better, you need communism. And if you want communism, you need to overrun capitalism. And if you want to overturn capitalism, you need to leave religion behind. Marx was a brilliant man. Brilliant. And I think he, in his heart, had the best intentions for humanity. Which is why I don't think Marx would have approved of what happened next. But it happened nonetheless. In 1917, Russia was in chaos. The people were angry. They were inspired by Marx and communism and a world where everyone had everything in common. They looked back to the French Revolution and were inspired by that too. So inspired by Marx and cries of revolution, the Russian people overthrew their capitalistic government. They took down the Tsar, the ruler of Russia. They executed the Tsar and his family. The revolutionaries even shot the Tsar's daughters. though they couldn't find the body of his youngest daughter, Anastasia. And so we get to enjoy many Disney movies about it. The revolution overthrew the Tsar, and the communists came to power in Russia, and they began redistributing power and wealth to make Russia a communist society. They made atheism the official belief system of the country. It was taught in schools, and they started creating anti-religious propaganda. Thousands of religious leaders were arrested or killed. In 1922, the communists created the first Russian concentration camp. They began torturing and executing bishops, priests, and the laity there. Tens of thousands of people were killed. And when Joseph Stalin came to power, he declared a 5-year plan of atheism, intent on completely eliminating religious expression in Russia. Between 1937 and 1938 alone, 168,000 church clergy were arrested, and of these, over 100,000 were shot. Russian Christians secretly called them the new martyrs of Russia. The new martyrs of Russia. Some Christians were even declared insane for believing and sent to mental hospitals, where the government did mind control and psychological experiments on them to try and get them to change their beliefs. In total, the number of Christians killed under communist Russia was between 12 and 20 million. Though many of those people were killed for additional reasons beyond just their faith, the fact remains that an atheistic government killed 12 to 20 million Christians. That doesn't prove atheism is bad, any more than the Crusades prove that religion is bad. But it nonetheless is a very different story from the one you've probably heard in school. In fact, because our education system has been so influenced by Marx, we tend to focus on the mistakes religion has made while conveniently ignoring the mistakes atheism has made, because we've inherited Marx's idea that religion is opium, but atheism must be enlightening. And if an atheist makes a mistake, it's because they weren't true to their beliefs. But if a Christian does, it was in the name of their religion. Communist Russia killed 12 to 20 million Christians. Not since the book of Acts and the persecution of the early church by Rome had Christians been so persecuted. In the Bible, in Luke chapter 14, there's an interesting story. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them he said, "Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and count the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, "This person began to build and wasn't able to finish." Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able, with 10,000 men, to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Count the cost. A builder counts the cost of building a tower, right? He counts how much money ahead of time the wood and bricks and tools are going to cost him and how much time it'll cost him to build it, and he decides whether or not he wants to bother with it. In the same way, if you want to be a Christian, you should count the cost. Count up all the time and energy and sweat and tears and sacrifices God is asking of you, and decide if you want to bother with it. If a king is going to war, won't he sit down and count the cost and see if he can handle and afford it? In the same way, you should sit down and count the cost of following Jesus. Because Jesus is not just asking you to give him some of you, or just a little piece of you. No, Jesus says, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Count the cost. And in North America, that seems a little weird. That seems a little weird to us. The cost is everything. Can't we just be half in? Can't we just come to church, sing songs, feel better about ourselves, eat snacks, and be on our way? Is the cost of following Jesus really everything? Really? It's difficult for us here to understand counting the cost. But it was clear as day in communist Russia. In communist Russia, following Jesus meant you could lose your life. You could be tortured, taken away from your family, shipped off to labor camps in Siberia, submitted to a mental institution, shot and thrown in a ditch with your brothers and sisters. The cost of following Jesus was clear. The cost was everything. And they counted it. The Russian Christians knew their life was on the line. So many of them abandoned their faith and embraced atheism. They counted the cost, and it was just too high for them to pay. But many of them stayed strong. Many of them remained Christian. They were willing to sacrifice everything for what they believed. They counted the cost and decided that they were willing to pay it with their lives. Count the cost. We often like to imagine that Jesus isn't really asking that much of us. I want an easy, convenient, nice faith that makes me feel good. We want a religion that gives us a spiritual high. We want a drug. We want the opium of the masses. We want a modern religion that does everything for us but doesn't ask too much in return, whatever works for you. And Jesus says back to us, okay, you can do whatever you want, but don't pretend you're actually following me. Because I'm not talking about a self-help book or a nice way to spend your Sunday mornings. No, I'm talking about an all-encompassing, all-in kind of faith. Jesus says, I was willing to die on a cross for you. Are you willing to die for me? And if Christianity isn't true, then obviously who cares? It might be a nice way to feel better, and you can use it to fellowship with people and all that, but it shouldn't ask too much of you. But if Christianity is true, if Jesus really meant what he said, it's not just a nice, convenient aid to your life. No, if it's true, it changes everything. It should change who you are, how you are living, what you're living for, why we are here. It's a radically different way of being in the world. It's not something you can have to, or just dip your toes in and see if the water's too cold. No, it's an all or nothing sort of deal. Jesus isn't asking for one day of your week. He's not asking for one part of you. He's asking for all of you. Your time, money, energy, heart, mind, body, fears, insecurities, sexuality, career, freedom, desires, and dreams, and if necessary, your bloody life. If love is to lay down your life for another, then you can't truly love God until you are willing to lay down all of yourself for him. Jesus is asking you to give it all up for him, just like the Russian Christians were willing to, and just like he gave up his whole life for you on a cross. Just like Stephen the martyr did when he died in the book of Acts. Just like Paul did when he got beheaded by the Roman government. So count the cost. Don't come into your faith thinking Jesus is asking less of you than he really is. Be aware of the cost. The cost is everything. Be aware of how much he's asking of you. And that doesn't mean you have to be perfect overnight and can't ever struggle. But it does mean you need to understand where this is headed, understand what he is ultimately asking, what the end goal you're striving towards is. Don't be the person who starts building the tower, then realizes they don't actually have it in them to get it done. Don't be the Christian who gets halfway through their life, then as soon as some deep part of them is on the line, they say, well, I didn't know it would cost this much. Jesus says it right here. It costs everything. Don't say he didn't warn you. You may not be in communist Russia. You may not be worried about dying for Jesus, but there is still a cost, and you need to count it. The cost of giving up living like the rest of the world to fit in. The cost of giving up your busy schedule to busy yourself instead with the things of God. The cost of spending time with God daily. I mean, if Russian Christians can die smuggling Bibles into their country, we can bloody well spend 10 minutes a day reading the Bible. The cost of giving up your ego and stubbornness to submit your will to God's will. The cost of glorifying God instead of yourself. The cost of getting baptized and going all in, even if your family or culture or friends don't feel like you should. The cost of following Jesus, even though you know it will be hard. Even though you still have self-doubts, even though you've never done anything like this before, even though you're afraid to go all in. The cost of giving up your habits so you can worship God instead of worshiping a computer or sports or porn or computer games. The cost of giving over your relationships, your sex life, body and soul, giving them over to God. Handing them over to God and saying, I don't know what to do here. Lead me. I trust you with these things. The cost of giving up your freedom to do whatever you feel like so you can be part of something greater than just what you feel like in the moment. The cost of giving up being first. The cost of giving up trying to be great like Napoleon. The cost of being willing to be last. The cost of true greatness. The cost of giving up the capitalistic dream of self-fulfillment, power and might and money. And that last point is interesting, isn't it? The cost of giving up the capitalistic dream of self-fulfillment and power and might and money and success. It almost sounds like communism, doesn't it? If you remember, we started this series, AD 33 to 2015, in the book of Acts, in the Bible. And in Acts 2, right after Jesus left and the Spirit came down, it says something interesting. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of the people. Part of the cost of being a Christian is being willing to give up your property and possessions to give to those who have need, so that everyone can have everything in common. Part of the cost of following Jesus is giving up your capitalistic dream of building up your personal empire of fancy cars, homes, and dream jobs. Part of the cost of being a Christian is using your luck and wealth and privilege to help elevate those in the lower classes and those who are less fortunate. Part of the cost of being a Christian is giving your time, energy, money, heart, and soul to taking care of the poor and beating down the lines between the classes so we can all have everything in common. Part of the cost of being a Christian is actually being willing to live a life that is similar to parts of communism. Though I don't agree with Marx about a lot of things, I think there's something deeply Christian at the root of Marx's theories. Marx was adopting an economic policy that the Bible was living out 2,000 years earlier in the book of Acts? Would Marx's ideas even have been thinkable before Christianity gave culture these ideas? Now, I definitely don't think we should all just go be communists. It's far more complex than that, and obviously there are parts of communism that we just can't accept. But I think Marx and Jesus do share their critique of the Western world, of our capitalistic, self-serving, individualistic ways. Capitalism is about self-fulfillment, health, wealth, and the American dream. Christianity is about serving humanity, loving everyone regardless of class, using your health and wealth to give hope to the dreams of the less fortunate. Capitalism is all about me, how I can build my empire, how I can follow my dreams, how I can be first, how I can get as much as I can, how I can be first. But Jesus is all about others. How can I build God's kingdom? How can I help others realize their dreams? How can I give as much as I can? How can we have everything in common? Capitalism asks, how much can I charge people? But Jesus asks, what is the cost? I'm willing to pay anything for my people. The cost of following Jesus is giving up the capitalistic, self-indulgent health and wealth of the American dream. And if we want to prove Marx wrong about the opium thing, if we want to prove that religion doesn't just drug the masses and reaffirm the status quo, we need to look no further than Jesus himself. Jesus constantly questioned the system. Jesus spent time with the poor and prostitutes and the lower class. You know who Jesus preached the most against? Who do you think it was? It wasn't prostitutes. It wasn't thieves. It wasn't homosexuals or abortionists or the top lists of most people in the news who are Christians. No, the people Jesus preached the most against is the rich, the wealthy, the people at the top running the system. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Jesus undermined the government. And he rebelled even against the religious establishment. So what did they do? They called Jesus a rebel and they crucified him. If you're looking for someone to question the status quo and fight the system, you can look 2,000 years earlier than Karl Marx to a poor Jewish peasant called Jesus. Sometimes Christianity loses its way and becomes an opium for the masses. But anyone who takes Jesus seriously doesn't have that option. Religion that follows Jesus must be religion that challenges injustice and fights oppression and questions itself and the world. Religion that follows Jesus should not preserve itself and the system, but instead sacrifice and dedicate itself to make a better system. The cost of following Jesus is giving your entire life to serving God and humanity. The cost of following Jesus is giving up our modern, capitalistic, individualistic, self-serving, self-fulfilling, self-help, new age opium of the masses. The cost of following Jesus is not 3 easy payments of $9.99. No, the cost of following Jesus is all of you. It's you. Whether that means dying in communist Russia, or fighting the system in capitalistic North America, or something far more personal than that, something you need to sacrifice that you've been holding on to, but you know God wants you to give up. As Jesus said, whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower, won't you first sit down and count the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. In AD 33, Jesus left us a mission. His Spirit came to bring it to fruition. Then Peter pissed off the Sanhedrin, so Saul martyred Stephen. But Saul became Paul and went through many trials to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. Soon, a new Bible began to form, its survival tested by a Gnostic swarm as Constantine took Rome by storm. Yet swift was the fall of Rome, so Augustine made heaven our true home. Dark Ages, Quran's pages, the crusade rages on. Plagues here, deaths near, Dante, where have we gone? 1500s, Luther thunders, God's grace was louder than the Pope's indignation. Luther launched the Protestant Reformation. Secularism, get out of the public sphere. Naturalism, no miracles here. Revolution, freedom is near. Religion is the opium of the masses. Communism alone will unite the classes. Religion is the opium of the masses. Communism alone will unite the classes. From revolution to France, to Karl Marx, to revolution in Russia, from afar, over the past few months, we've watched the evolution of ideas play out. We've stepped back from afar and looked at the bigger picture of AD history. But next week, it's going to get more personal for our little Chinese-Canadian church. The action's going to hit closer to home. In the next step of AD history, communism is coming to China. See you next week.